I used to think there wasn't much left in this world that could surprise me. You don't lose your only son in combat, spend years learning how to breathe around that kind of silence, and still expect ordinary people to find new ways to hurt you. But somehow, a homeowners association managed to do exactly that. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, a retired middle school history teacher living in the quiet little community of Willow Creek outside Columbus, Ohio. And the morning this story began, I had just come back from my annual appointment at the VA hospital. My knees were aching from sitting too long. I had a paper bag with my prescriptions resting on the passenger seat, and all I could think about was making a cup of coffee before the afternoon rain rolled in. I pulled into my driveway like I had thousands of times before, but something felt wrong before I even shut off the engine. There was an empty space beside my front door, a spot my eyes had found every single day for nearly 12 years. At first, I honestly thought someone had stolen it. Then I noticed the bright orange envelope taped to the storm door. I remember standing there with my keys still in my hand, reading the notice twice because my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. Community violation. Fine amount, $1,500. Unauthorized display removed by the association. Failure to comply with community appearance standards could result in additional daily penalties. I just stood there staring at those words while the wind pushed dead leaves across my porch. The display they called unauthorized wasn't some political banner or oversized decoration. It was a Gold Star family sign honoring my son, Captain Benjamin Carter, who had been awarded the Medal of Honor after sacrificing his life to save members of his unit during an ambush in Afghanistan. That little blue and gold sign wasn't decoration. It was the closest thing I had to hearing his voice every morning. I looked at the screws still sticking out of the siding where it had been mounted, and for a second it felt like somebody had reached inside my chest and pulled open a wound I had spent over a decade trying to stitch together. I called the HOA office immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. By evening, I had left 4 messages. None of them angry, just asking who had authorized removing private property from my home. Nobody answered. The next morning, I drove over to the clubhouse. I'd lived there almost 9 years and rarely had any reason to go inside. The board president, Ronald Pierce, was sitting behind the front desk with his polished smile, while the property manager, Denise Holloway, leaned against the filing cabinet scrolling through her phone like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. Ronald looked up, recognized me, and without even asking why I was there, slid a payment form across the desk. Mrs. Carter, if you'll just pay the violation and avoid reinstalling the display, we can close this matter today. I stared at the paper, then looked back at him. Where's my sign? He shrugged. Maintenance removed it. Then I'd like it back. Denise finally looked up, folded her arms, and sighed like I was wasting her morning. That memorial was upsetting potential buyers, she said. People don't move into neighborhoods because they want constant reminders of tragedy. I could feel my heartbeat climbing into my throat, but I still kept my voice calm. You're talking about my son. She rolled her eyes. With respect, your son died years ago. The neighborhood has to move forward. I don't know if she planned to keep talking or if she simply forgot there are moments in life when words can never be taken back, because what she said next froze the entire room. Honestly, she muttered, he died for a war most people don't even think about anymore. Why should everyone else have to look at it every day? Ronald didn't stop her. He didn't apologize. He simply tapped the payment form with his finger and said, "Sign here, Mrs. Carter." I picked up the form, folded it neatly in half, set it back on his desk, and walked out without saying another word. Sometimes silence says more than anger ever could. I drove home, unlocked my front door, and sat in the living room staring at the folded American flag resting inside its glass case above the fireplace. Next to it sat Ben's Medal of Honor citation, a photograph of him laughing with dirt on his face halfway around the world, and another picture taken the day President handed me his medal. 12 years had passed. But grief has a strange way of ignoring calendars. It doesn't disappear. It simply learns how to sit quietly beside you until someone gives it permission to speak again. That afternoon it was louder than it had been in years. As the rain began tapping against my windows, I remembered something I'd almost forgotten. At Ben's funeral in Arlington, one of the speakers had been Senator Daniel Whitmore, then a member of the Armed Services Committee. Years later, after a veterans education fundraiser, he'd handed me a business card and told me, "If your family ever needs anything, you don't hesitate." I had never used it. Not once. The card was still tucked inside the same Bible I'd carried to Ben's memorial service. I walked over, opened it carefully, found the card exactly where I'd left it, and stared at the email address for a very long time. Then I looked back at the empty spot beside my front door through the window. For the first time since leaving that HOA office, I smiled, not because I knew what was about to happen, but because I realized something Ronald and Denise had completely overlooked. They thought they had taken down a sign. They had no idea they had just awakened a mother who no longer had anything left to be afraid of. I didn't send that email right away. People like to imagine moments like this happen in a burst of righteous anger, fingers flying across the keyboard while dramatic music plays in the background. But real life doesn't work that way. I made dinner I barely touched, fed my old Labrador named Molly, watched half of a baseball game without remembering a single inning, and around 11 that night I finally sat down at my kitchen table with my reading glasses, my laptop, and a cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were newspaper clippings, military letters, photographs, copies of Ben's citations, and a stack of sympathy cards from people I'd never met. Near the bottom was Senator Whitmore's business card, slightly bent at one corner but still perfectly readable. I stared at it for several minutes before opening my laptop. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't looking to ruin anyone's life. I simply wanted someone, somewhere, to understand what had happened. My email was barely 3 paragraphs long. I introduced myself, reminded him who Ben was, attached photographs of the empty space beside my front door, attached a scan of the violation notice, then attached something I almost didn't include, the audio recording from my phone. Ohio allows one-party consent recordings, and years of teaching middle school had made me develop a habit of recording meetings whenever I felt something might go sideways. I hadn't planned on using it. It had simply started recording while sitting inside my purse at the HOA office. Every word Denise spoke was there. Every pause, every smug little laugh, every syllable of, "Your son died years ago. People need to move on." I ended the email with one sentence. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking whether honoring a fallen service member has somehow become a violation. Then I hit send just after midnight, closed the laptop, and honestly expected never to hear another word about it. The next week was strangely quiet. Ronald kept mailing notices. Another fine appeared, then another. According to the HOA, I now owed nearly $2,000 because I had failed to remove an object that no longer even existed. A few neighbors quietly stopped by. Mrs. Donnelly from 3 houses down brought over banana bread and hugged me without saying much. Her husband had served in Vietnam. He understood silence better than conversation. Another neighbor whispered that Ronald had been bragging during the monthly board meeting about finally making the neighborhood look more marketable. Apparently, he'd claimed buyers didn't want to see reminders of military deaths while touring homes. Funny thing about communities, most people stay quiet because they assume someone else will speak up. They don't realize silence is exactly what people abusing power count on. 9 days after I sent that email, I heard a knock at my front door around 8:30 in the morning. I figured it was another certified letter from the HOA. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stood on my porch holding identification wallets. One introduced himself as Special Agent Michael Reyes. The other was Special Agent Laura Kim. Neither smiled much. Agent Reyes asked politely if they could come inside to discuss a complaint involving possible violations of recently enacted protections for military families. I invited them into the kitchen, made coffee out of habit, and for the next 2 hours answered questions I never imagined anyone would ask. They weren't interested only in my sign. They wanted names, dates, previous board members, complaints I'd heard over the years. Had other veterans ever mentioned similar treatment? Had military flags been challenged? Had memorial displays disappeared before? At first, I didn't know. Then little memories began connecting together like puzzle pieces. Mr. Franklin across the lake had once been ordered to remove a Marine Corps banner because it was considered non-conforming. A widow named Sharon had quietly moved away after months of disputes over the Purple Heart flag she flew every Memorial Day. An elderly Korean War veteran had stopped attending neighborhood events after repeated arguments over the small memorial plaque outside his flower garden. None of us had connected those stories before. We thought they were isolated incidents. The agents wrote everything down. Before leaving, Agent Kim paused at my front door, looked at the empty place where Ben's sign had once hung, and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Carter, people who disrespect sacrifice rarely stop with one family." 3 days later, Ronald Pierce didn't look nearly as confident. Half the neighborhood watched as federal investigators walked into the HOA office carrying boxes of documents out several hours later. Rumors exploded overnight. Some claimed someone had stolen association funds. Others whispered about tax fraud. Nobody knew the truth yet, but everyone saw the black SUVs parked outside the clubhouse. Ronald tried reassuring residents through a community email, calling the investigation a routine administrative review. But confidence is a fragile thing. Once people smell fear on someone who has acted untouchable for years, they begin asking questions they've been afraid to ask before. Those questions spread faster than wildfire. My phone started ringing constantly. Veterans I'd never met called after hearing bits and pieces through local organizations. Gold Star parents from neighboring counties shared stories almost identical to mine. One family had been told their folded American flag display was too depressing for neighborhood aesthetics. Another had been fined over a battlefield memorial bench. It was as though someone had quietly opened a door that had kept years of hidden resentment locked away. About 2 weeks later, Senator Whitmore called personally. I almost ignored the number because I didn't recognize it. His voice hadn't changed much over the years. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I wish we were speaking under better circumstances." We talked nearly 40 minutes. He didn't make promises. Politicians often do that. Instead, he asked careful questions, took notes himself, and apologized more than once for what my family had endured. Before hanging up, he said, "There appears to be a pattern developing here, and patterns become policy issues." I didn't fully understand what he meant until another week passed and a formal hearing was announced before a state legislative oversight committee examining discrimination against military families and residential associations. Suddenly, television crews appeared outside Willow Creek. News vans parked across from the entrance. Reporters interviewed neighbors who, only a month earlier, had pretended none of this involved them. Ronald hired attorneys. Denise deleted her social media accounts. The HOA board issued carefully worded statements claiming misunderstandings and communication failures. Nobody denied removing my sign anymore. Now they simply argued they had legal authority to regulate exterior displays. Funny how quickly people change their arguments when the evidence becomes impossible to deny. The hearing itself took place on a Tuesday morning inside a packed committee chamber downtown. I'd never seen so many cameras pointed at ordinary people. Ronald wore an expensive navy suit that suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big. Denise refused to look in my direction. I sat quietly behind my attorney with Ben's photograph tucked inside my folder. The committee asked Ronald simple questions first. Did the HOA authorize removal of private memorial property? Yes. Did the board issue financial penalties afterward? Yes. Was the display associated with a fallen Medal of Honor recipient? Yes. Then, Senator Whitmore leaned forward slightly and asked whether anyone from the board remembered comments made during my visit to the office. Ronald glanced toward Denise. Denise stared at the table. "I don't recall the exact conversation," Ronald answered carefully. "Fortunately," the senator replied, "memory isn't our only source." The room fell completely silent as the committee technician pressed play. My own voice came first, calm, asking where my son's sign had gone. Ronald's voice followed. Then Denise. Every cruel sentence echoed through the chamber with crystal clarity. "People need to move on." A pause. Then the line that drained every bit of color from her face. "Why should everyone have to look at it every day?" Nobody interrupted. Nobody objected. Nobody even coughed. When the recording ended, the silence somehow became louder than the audio itself. Senator Whitmore removed his glasses, looked directly at the committee, then quietly said, "This hearing is no longer about landscaping rules or neighborhood appearance. It is about whether ordinary citizens can be punished for honoring extraordinary sacrifice." At that moment, I realized this story had stopped belonging only to me. It belonged to every family who had ever been told their grief was inconvenient. And I had a feeling the hardest part for Ronald Pierce and Denise Holloway was only just beginning. When people ask me what justice feels like, they usually expect me to describe the moment someone gets arrested, or the second a judge bangs a gavel, or maybe the instant the person who caused so much pain finally realizes they've lost. The truth is, justice is much quieter than that. It sneaks up on you in small moments, almost gently. After you spent so long expecting disappointment that you don't recognize hope when it finally walks through the door. The hearing ended just before lunch, but the consequences were only beginning. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, The Ohio Attorney General announced a civil enforcement action against the Willow Creek Homeowners Association for discriminatory practices and unlawful removal of private property. Federal investigators added separate penalties tied to violations involving protected military families under recently enacted state law. Ronald Pierce and Denise Holloway weren't facing prison, despite what some people online later claimed, but the financial consequences were devastating enough. The association itself was fined hundreds of thousands of dollars. Its liability insurance refused to renew coverage, and Ronald and Denise were both held personally responsible for significant civil penalties after investigators concluded they had knowingly approved actions outside the authority granted by the governing documents. Within a week, every remaining board member resigned. The management company terminated its contract before anyone could even ask why. State regulators suspended the HOA's nonprofit status pending complete restructuring, and Ronald and Denise were permanently prohibited from serving on the board of any homeowners association operating under state registration. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I didn't feel the urge to. I simply drove home, made another cup of coffee, and sat on my porch where Ben's sign used to hang. That evening, neighbors started walking over one after another. Some apologized for staying silent. Some admitted they'd been afraid of Ronald for years. Others confessed they had seen similar things happen but convinced themselves it wasn't their business. I never blamed them. Fear has a way of making decent people look away, and courage often arrives only after someone else takes the first step. Mrs. Donnelly squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your boy would be proud of you." I smiled, but inside I was thinking the opposite. I hoped I had finally been worthy of him. About 2 months later, Senator Whitmore invited me back to Columbus. He wanted me to meet with several legislative staff members and a handful of Gold Star families from across the state. We spent hours around one long conference table, not talking about revenge, but about prevention. Family after family shared stories that sounded painfully familiar. Memorial flags removed, military emblems labeled offensive, service banners declared violations. None of us wanted special treatment. We simply wanted to make sure no parent would ever again have to defend the memory of a child who never came home. That meeting eventually became the foundation for something much larger than any of us expected. Lawyers drafted language. Veteran organizations offered amendments. Civil rights advocates suggested stronger enforcement mechanisms. Military families testified. Months passed. The bill changed names twice before finally reaching the Senate floor. I watched nearly every committee session from home, sometimes laughing at how complicated government can be, sometimes crying because every paragraph reminded me why the process mattered. Then, one crisp October morning, Senator Whitmore called again. "Mrs. Carter," he said, sounding happier than I'd ever heard him, "I think you should clear your schedule for next Tuesday." I asked why. He laughed softly. "Because I'd like you sitting in the front row." The governor signed the Military Family Memorial Protection Act on what would have been Ben's 38th birthday. I don't believe in coincidences anymore. Some dates simply choose themselves. The ceremony wasn't enormous. No marching bands. No dramatic speeches that lasted forever. Just families, veterans, lawmakers from both parties, and a room filled with people who understood that respect isn't a political issue. It's a human one. Near the end of the ceremony, the governor held up the pen used to sign the bill, walked directly toward me, and placed it in my hands. "This belongs with your son's story," he said quietly. For a second, I couldn't answer. My throat closed up the same way it had the day military officers knocked on my front door 12 years earlier, except this time, the tears weren't arriving because something had been taken away. They came because something precious had been protected for families I'd never even meet. A week later, I mounted a new sign beside my front door. It looked almost identical to the old one, except for one small line engraved beneath the Gold Star emblem, protected under Ohio law. I tightened the final screw myself, stepped back into the driveway, and smiled. Several neighbors happened to be outside. Nobody complained. Nobody looked uncomfortable. In fact, old Mr. Jenkins from across the street, a retired Navy mechanic who rarely spoke more than 5 words at a time, gave me a quiet salute before continuing his evening walk. That meant more to me than any courtroom victory ever could. Ronald eventually sold his house and moved away. Denise disappeared from public life altogether, at least as far as I know. I don't spend my days wondering what became of either of them. Carrying resentment is exhausting, and I've carried enough weight for one lifetime already. I'd rather spend my energy volunteering with military families, speaking to civic groups, and reminding people that communities aren't measured by how perfectly their lawns are trimmed or how uniform their mailboxes look. They're measured by how they treat the people who sacrificed the most when nobody was watching. Every now and then, someone driving through the neighborhood slows down in front of my house. They notice the sign. Sometimes they wave. Sometimes they simply nod. I like to imagine there are other parents out there who feel just a little safer knowing the lawn now stands beside them if someone ever tries to erase their child's memory for the sake of appearances. Ben's photograph still sits above my fireplace. The folded flag is still there. The silence is still there too. Losing a child isn't something you recover from. You simply learn to build a life that honors the love instead of surrendering to the grief. And maybe that's the lesson this whole journey taught me. People can remove a sign. They can issue fines. They can abuse authority for a while, but they cannot erase sacrifice. And they certainly cannot rewrite the legacy of someone who gave everything for people they'd never meet. So now I'd like to ask you something. If a homeowners association told a Gold Star family that honoring their fallen son or daughter made the neighborhood look less appealing, where do you think the line should be drawn? Was this board simply enforcing community rules? Or did they cross a moral line no rulebook should ever protect? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because conversations like this matter. If this story moved you, pass it along so more people remember that sometimes the strongest act of justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with one ordinary person refusing to stay silent.